What's up? You are now listening to Americanized, a storytelling podcast where you'll hear from eclectic first and second generation Americans share their stories and real life experiences as children of immigrants. I'm your host Roslyn, and in this episode, you get to meet Julie Pham. Julie is a Vietnamese-born, American-raised refugee who holds many titles. She is a Cambridge-trained social scientist, an award-winning community organizer, an Amazon best-selling author, TEDx speaker, and the CEO of CuriosityBased, which is an organization dedicated to helping teams and individuals practice curiosity at work. Stay tuned to hear more of Julie's story.
Yes. So I have two names. Julie is my American name and Hoai Hung is my Vietnamese name. So I was born in Vietnam in 1979. I came with my parents as boat people when I was 2 months old. So Hoai Hung means to remember one's homeland. And my parents gave me that name because they knew that they weren't going to go back to Vietnam, that when we left, that we were escaping communist Vietnam. My father had served in the South Vietnamese military, and he had been put into a re-education camp for 3 years after the war. And so after the war ended in 1975. And so when we left, it was definitely to flee communism. And I grew up in Seattle, and my parents founded the first privately owned Vietnamese language newspaper in the Pacific Northwest. And so that's a really important part of my identity.
That is amazing. Just you're coming here. How was it growing up? I mean, you do have two names. So
Mm-hmm.
did you go by your American name while here, or like how did you incorporate your Vietnamese name?
I didn't. So growing up at Hoai Hung, I would go. My parents would sometimes say Hung, so the second part of that. I didn't actually understand or learn the meaning of the name until I was in college, and I started doing some research. I majored in history, and I started interviewing South Vietnamese military veterans for my undergraduate thesis. And then someone else pointed out, oh, Hoai Hung, that means this, and so that's when I actually discovered it as an adult. So I spoke Vietnamese until I was about 5, and then I entered the school system, and that's actually when I remember being given my American name, Julie. And my parents had had a French education in Vietnam, and so Julie is actually a French name, Julie. So yeah, I grew up in the generation where people assimilation was really important. So I didn't actually study Vietnamese until after I graduated from college. And it was also the time where my parents just worked all the time, and I was a latchkey kid. I was just definitely the tail end of Generation Xer, so yeah, all of those different experiences.
Wow, that's really interesting. So not knowing what your name means until being an adult in college is
Mm-hmm.
really interesting because our names do carry so much meaning. And as I was saying before, my friend who was Vietnamese, it's interesting actually now that I think about it. She doesn't have an American name,
Mm-hmm.
but her sister does, and I don't know if her sister has a Vietnamese name, but
Mm-hmm.
her sister has the same name as you, actually,
Mm-hmm.
Julie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
my friend's name is, I guess the Americanized name, an Americanized version of her name is Lee, but it would be Lei,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yes.
and she has a meaning to her name as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I when I went back to Vietnam and I lived on and off in Vietnam in my 20s, a lot of people, Hoai Hung actually is a Sino-Vietnamese name. And so a lot of people in Vietnam actually don't, if they don't know Sino-Vietnamese, they don't know the meaning of the name either. So
Mm.
Sino-Vietnamese being much more of probably do you know the Latin roots of English, right? So it's, and so sometimes I would actually test people to see how their Vietnamese was, if they could actually understand what the name meant. And also I feel very comfortable in both. I know sometimes people have asked me, oh, well, do you feel that you wish you had grown up with your Vietnamese name? And I feel that I get to be Julie, and I also get to be Hoai Hung, and it depends on the context I'm in. So I don't feel any less than when I'm using one name or the other.
Right. That is a good point. It's like you can be both at the same time. Do you find yourself, I'm going to use the term code switching, but correct me if that's wrong. Do you find yourself code switching often depending on the crowd you're with and which name you use?
Well, so I only really use Hoài Hung when I'm speaking to my Vietnamese friends. So I wouldn't,
Okay.
and my Vietnamese friends, unless they've really met me in a context where we spoke a lot of English, would use that name. And so, and I actually don't think of, I know some people really think of code switching as negative, and I feel it's negative if people feel that they must do it. I actually think of
Mhm.
code switching as strategic communication, and I get to
Yes.
code switch. I get to be in a lots of different contexts, which gives me access to lots of different communities. So I'm actually really proud of my ability to do that.
I like that. I like that you said you get to, because there's a mindset thing there. Instead of saying you have to code switch
Mm-hmm.
because XYZ, you get to code switch. And that's something that not everybody has the privilege of doing. And it is there's a positivity in that. So I like that you said that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Could you explain, you said Sino Vietnamese? What is that?
Oh, yeah. So
Sorry,
Sino-Vietnamese,
I
it's
don't know.
basically Chinese Vietnamese. And so a lot of Vietnamese is a lot of the Vietnamese language derives from Chinese. And actually, after 1975, after the war ended, Vietnam, the government actually went through this process of Vietnamifying the language and trying to remove as much Chinese elements as possible. And so the South Vietnamese community um, that left right after the war, there's still a lot of Sino-Vietnamese in the language, and so it's considered when I lived in Vietnam, it's those words are considered old-fashioned,
Mm,
and yet by Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, they're considered classy, right? Because it's like, oh,
mm,
they're elevated, they're sophisticated. We can, and so it's. I've heard this of the Cuban experience where the Spanish that's spoken from Cubans outside of Cuba it's considered this Spanish of the period when they left in the 1950s and 60s. And so that's, I mean, the Vietnamese that's spoken by the South Vietnamese community that came in the 70s and 80s. It's of that particular period. And so the Vietnamese that's spoken in Vietnam now, and I spent quite a bit of time in communist Vietnam, is it's it's uh it's more Vietnamese. It doesn't have as
mm.
many Chinese elements.
I see. Like, I guess you could say it's more authentic or true
Mm-hmm.
to the roots of Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I learned something new today. Thank
Mm-hmm.
you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like going back to Vietnam?
It was it was actually really hard. So the first time I went back it was after my master's, and I went for a year-long study abroad program to study Vietnamese. And at that point, I had studied for a summer intensively. So I had the basics. And so coming back was really to be immersed in it. And I lived in Hanoi. So my parents are originally from the north, but they grew up in South Vietnam. And so imagine Hanoi, and the northern Vietnamese is like British English to American English, which is the Southern Vietnamese is like American English, and Northern Vietnamese is like British English. And so there
Mm,
is a pretty big accent difference. And I'd say that it was hard because people would look at me and they were just, well, you look Vietnamese. And this was my first time was in 2002. You look
okay.
Vietnamese, but you don't speak Vietnamese. And there weren't that many people who were Vietnamese coming back to Vietnam at that point. And a lot of Vietnamese couldn't understand how, if you're Vietnamese, and how do you not speak Vietnamese?
Hmm.
And so they were
Interesting.
really critical of my Vietnamese. And so it was honestly very emotionally hard to constantly get criticized. And so there were times where I would actually pretend that I was Chinese or Korean. It's just,
Hmm.
yes. Oh, and then it's like, oh, your Vietnamese is so good. It's like, thank you. Right. Because if it was just like, well, I'm Vietnamese American, they would be, well, why is your Vietnamese so bad? Didn't your parents teach
Oh.
you? And they have this word, mat gulp, which means to lose your roots. And so yeah, there was that. And then there was the language aspect. And also my parents worked all the time. So I didn't actually have much exposure to Vietnamese food until I lived in Vietnam, and even to a
Okay.
lot of just Vietnamese cultural things. It was just, and so that was all a lot of learning. And one of the big things My parents didn't want me to go back because they thought that their sweet Seattle daughter would be just would be too naive. And what I did realize was in the US, we are innocent until proven guilty.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, there's a certain paranoia that comes from living in a police state that I could not understand until I actually lived there. And I mean, I went to Berkeley for my undergrad, so it's super liberal. And I remember thinking, oh, my parents, it's not that bad. And then when
Yeah.
I lived in Vietnam, I really understood what it meant to live in a communist state, for people to be afraid of what they were going to say outside. And Rosalind, I
Mm-hmm.
have many stories about understanding that, and so it was a hard reality though to realize that people it's a constant people are suspicious of each other. I mean, they're very warm and they give to people who they know, but they're also there's a lot of low level suspicion and paranoia.
Hmm. Definitely, please share the stories just so I can
Yeah, so let me
visualize
give
and
you
grasp.
yeah.
Yeah.
So here's one story. So this happened when it was so my Vietnamese was actually it was 2007, 2008. So by then my Vietnamese was fluent. And I was living
Mhm.
with my best friend who was also Vietnamese American, and she had always had white roommates before, housemates before. And the way that they collect bills in Vietnam is they come to your door and they collect the bill. They say, here's your bill, and you pay cash on the spot. And so foreigners pay more. Their bills are higher than locals. That's understood. And I remember getting a water bill. Just okay, here's my water bill. I paid it. And then I got the water bill again. I said, but it was a different piece of paper. And I said, why am I paying the water bill twice? And they were just, well, we don't know. It's like, well, I'm not paying the water bill twice, and I could read Vietnamese. And so then I got my housekeeper to go and investigate. It turns out that the head of the ward, the communist ward, that's how it's divided, was was sending her water bill to the foreigners' homes. And and so when I told this to friends, they were like, "Oh yeah, you always have to be watching out because you don't know
Wow.
who's going." And so it's actually my responsibility to watch my back. Here's another example.
Hmm.
My house, if you go to Hanoi, there are wires all over the place. And so there's this, my house it was originally part of this kind of Chinese style home with a courtyard in the middle. So my house was next to another home where we were just divided by a foot and there were all these wires in between. And I remember in the winter time, all the electrical outlets on one side that was kind of near the other house, they burnt out. So we couldn't plug in anything. So, all
Mm-hmm.
right, well, and so the power bill went down. And I realized, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. But then summer came. Summer, we use a lot of AC.
Right. Right.
My bill should have gone up,
Oh.
and it didn't. And I
Hmm.
realized my neighbors had been stealing my electricity.
Oh my goodness.
So that is just normal though. It's just kind of in talking to Vietnamese, it's just like, no, you always have to check because it's your
Mm.
responsibility to make sure people aren't cheating you.
Wow. Off of that, I know that as Americans, we are very confrontational
Mhm.
society. How did you handle those situations with did you confront them or
Well, I mean, in the second
was
situation, it's like my bill had gone down, but I
yeah,
in
yeah.
the other one, I didn't have to because the water bill person basically corrected it.
Okay.
So, in the case of the ward, and actually, I think it would have been worse if I had said something
Hmm.
because it would have been this losing face, right? So we had this middle person who was just, hey, just by the way, you've been sending the. I don't know how she worded it, but it's just this is not going to happen. That house isn't going to pay for your bills anymore. So,
Okay. Yeah.
and in terms of confrontation, yeah. So I think that there's just different levels of directness actually, because I think that Vietnamese are actually very direct in some contexts and indirect in others.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in Vietnamese, it's totally fine to say you're fat or you're not,
Right.
you look like you've gained weight or how much money do you make? And in America, we would never do that. But there
Mm-hmm.
are some things that we wouldn't say. So, for example, if you point out a mistake to someone, people tend to laugh
Okay.
out of embarrassment or out of just kind of, and it to when I first experienced this, I was just, are you not listening to me? Did
Mm.
you, are you mocking me? And
Mm-hmm.
it's just, oh no, it's kind of a laugh it off and we're not going to talk about it. So I had to learn a lot about just uh, the just different expectations in different contexts. It's not this big universal
Yeah.
rule.
There's like lots of nuances and
Mm-hmm.
unspoken rules. Did you experience any of that growing up with your parents?
You know, I that's a good question. I mean, I was really expected to not question my parents
Mm-hmm.
and not question their decisions. And there is very much of a hierarchical. I mean, I think even in Vietnamese, hierarchy is embedded in the language.
Mm.
And so, I mean, in English, you would never, or Vietnamese, you would never call your parents by their first name.
Right.
And I'm only who I am because in relation to you in Vietnamese, I'm always trying to figure out, am I younger, am I older? What's your relation to my parents?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there's uh I actually think that has clarity. It adds order.
Yeah.
And I don't actually think of it as a bad thing. I know some people think of hierarchy as bad and we need to disrupt hierarchy. I actually think it just makes things very easy to understand. um, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's true. Yes, you have like some clear definition
Mm-hmm.
of what to expect. Like not everyone is on the same level, but it sounds more like a respect thing.
Yeah. And I think also in English, well, in American English, there is actually hierarchy, but we try to hide it.
Mm.
And so it's actually a lot less clear. So for example, in I have a PhD and in the US, I kind of do I say I have a PhD? Do I
Right.
refer to myself as doctor? Is that going to be considered arrogant? Whereas
Mm-hmm.
in Vietnam, people are just this is would always introduce me with doctor.
Yeah.
And I would need to introduce myself as doctor. And it's not considered arrogant. It's honoring
Mm-hmm.
the what I've earned.
Right.
And
Right.
so whereas in the US, you're kind of constantly trying to figure out, is this, should I mention it here? Should I mention it there? It's whereas there is just you have that title,
Yeah.
so use it.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's funny you say that because just coming on and I looked at your name, I was like, oh, you're there's a doctor next to your name. Like I don't know, my I just there's this feeling that came over me that was like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I think that
Yeah,
kind
and I
of
mean that's something as because I've since I started my own business about 4 years ago, and I've realized I really need to use my doctor, and
hmm.
I have started to use it in addressing and referring to myself because it's actually just really helpful in my business.
Okay, yeah, just
Mhm.
practical
Yes,
use of
just
it.
practical, and I mean establishing credibility too
I
because
was gonna say,
I look
hmm,
young, and so I sometimes need to establish this, and it's I've had to learn how to feel comfortable doing that.
yeah, it's definitely a shift because
Mhm.
until you weren't, until you got that degree, you weren't a doctor or you
Mhm.
didn't have your PhD. So now it's this new thing and it's a really honorable, incredible thing that you have and you should own and we should be proud to say, yeah, like you just said it so casually, I have a PhD.
Mhm. Mhm.
But yeah, I wonder if it's more of like, I guess we do it to ourselves on a personal level. Like we don't want to seem too pompous or
Mhm.
cocky, overconfident. We should just flaunt it.
Yeah. Oh, and
You worked
it's
hard
kind of
for it.
it is what it is. So.
Yeah, yeah. Just like
Mhm.
in Vietnam, it's the truth. It's part of
Mhm.
your identity and your title.
Mhm.
Yeah. Speaking of identity and title, when you were talking about your friend who's Vietnamese American,
Mhm.
you said too. Do you also identify that way?
Yes, I do. I think actually people I'm considered the one and a half generation.
Mm,
So even though I was born in Vietnam, but I really grew up in the US. And I also identify as a refugee. So that's something my parents always made sure that we were really proud of, that we come from a refugee community. And I what I've learned over time is that some Vietnamese Americans didn't get that, that their parents that didn't speak about being a refugee proudly. And yet with my parents, and I think this is also because they ran the Vietnamese newspaper And we served, I mean, all our the newspaper is in Vietnamese. It serves Vietnamese businesses. And it's just there's always a sense of pride of look at how much we've accomplished. We came
Mm-hmm.
here with very little and look at what we've done. And so I've always associated being a refugee with resilience and resourcefulness, and also a willingness to support one another. And I also know that that's not the case for others. So I always grew up being very proud of being Vietnamese.
Oh, that's wonderful. Is there a Vietnamese community in Seattle that you guys were able to connect with easily and have that community?
Yes, and actually, I think of my parents as being at the center of that because
Oh,
they were
wonderful.
newspaper publishers. It was very, and that was probably another thing because so many, there'd be other Vietnamese American students. And if I wore a t-shirt that had our newspaper's name, it was just, oh, my parents read the newspaper.
Oh.
Right. And so it's just very, it's just, oh, we know who you are. And so, and my parents were always very active. And also then I feel that I also have that duty too, because I do speak Vietnamese. And so I feel like I can do a bit of bridge building, not just in terms of language, but also in terms of generations as
Mm-hmm.
well. Because I find that actually now the younger generation of maybe 20s, maybe early 30s, and my generation, there's this kind of divide between those who are youngish who can speak Vietnamese and those who can't. And then my parents' generation, which are the elders, 70s,
Mm-hmm.
80s, they really do speak primarily in Vietnamese. And
Right.
so I think that there's and so I get to bridge.
That's amazing that you get to, connect those two populations, those two communities of people.
Yeah, and I'll also say it was really, I mean, I studied Vietnamese as an adult. So I feel that I have a different relationship to the language, whereas
Mm-hmm.
just it I never take it for granted. It helped me understand how hard it was for my parents. I don't think I actually really developed that empathy until I started studying Vietnamese. And so my Vietnamese, I was able to do research in my Vietnamese. My parents' English vocabulary is much wider than mine, so they can talk about mortgages and banking,
Mm-hmm.
but I can talk about feelings. So my vocabulary is much deeper. And
Right.
so,
Okay.
and like our relationship fundamentally changed once I studied Vietnamese, once I could start speaking and communicating in Vietnamese. And now that's all that's how we communicate. We don't speak in English anymore. And it's interesting that the first 21 years of my life, I pretty much only spoke in English. And so I think that it helps. I recognize how hard it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting where a lot of people get so embarrassed. It's like, oh, well, I can't speak. It's just, but you can always learn. I mean, your parents are having to learn too, right? Like
Yeah,
someone's gotta move and try. And so
exactly.
and I think we can actually develop a lot of empathy when we recognize how hard it is and sometimes how embarrassing it is. Like when I said I had to go through a couple of years in Vietnam of being told your Vietnamese is really bad until I could get to your Vietnamese is very good.
That's amazing. Because I'm sure, like, empathy is definitely the word that came to mind when you were saying all of that. And then you said it, and I was like, yeah, that's what it is. You've developed that empathy. And I can't imagine pushing and keep going because I know that Vietnamese is a very tonal language.
Mhm.
And I don't know where you start. Like, how do you start learning Vietnamese and to not give up? And that's your resilience kicking in and
Mhm.
those qualities you have of identifying as a refugee that sounds like just pushed you to continue to learn Vietnamese. And you did multiple trips, or you lived in Vietnam for a year and
Yeah.
then went
Mhm.
multiple times back. Yeah.
And I think that also the a lot of my friends had these nice big scholarships in the beginning and I didn't. I had a little funding from my parents and so
Hmm.
I had to be so much I had to navigate so much more closely. I had to
Yeah.
learn Vietnamese.
Yes.
I mean, literally 30 cents mattered to me when I was negotiating in the marketplace because I had a very limited budget. And
Hmm.
so I'm actually really grateful for that I didn't get funding because it forced me to learn the language so much more deeply and quickly than a lot of my friends.
Absolutely. Because it's like, this is your parents' money and it's, you have
And
to
I don't
make
have
the
much of
most out
it.
of it. Yeah.
So, right. So,
Wow.
mhm.
We'll just dive quickly with the language piece. So you did answer the question I was going to ask. You only spoke English growing up.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until your 20s that you learned Vietnamese and then
Yeah.
you started speaking Vietnamese at home.
Mm-hmm.
What was
And it
that
was
shift
really,
like?
yeah. So it was actually, I studied Vietnamese in Madison, Wisconsin.
Oh,
They have a summer camp. It's a summer boot camp for Southeast Asian languages. And so it was between my it's the summer between graduating from college and going to grad school. And
mm,
so for 8 weeks, I had this intense Vietnamese language experience, and that was amazing. And then I spent a year for my master's, and then I spent a year. Then I went to Vietnam, kind of between my master's and my PhD. And and luckily Vietnamese is a it's a Romanized language, so it's not like Chinese. It's not script. It's
mm,
letters with tonal marks, and it's also phonetic. So the
right.
way that you say things is the way that you write things. And I'm quite visual,
Mm-hmm,
so I was able to. I knew that if I could write, I could sound out words,
mm-hmm,
and so I would write a lot to my parents, and I would have my tutors correct my writing, and I would read a lot. So it was very intense, and I'm really proud of the progress I made in a pretty short period of time.
yeah, that's outstanding. I just know it's a hard language, and
Mhm,
just
mhm,
hearing how you went through it is really, really amazing.
mhm.
Yeah, what was the shift like going from speaking English with with your parents to then Vietnamese only?
It felt so much more close and intimate.
Mm, wow.
So just the words, because again, I'm saying the how we refer to ourselves. So because in English I would say I, but in Vietnamese I say child. I refer to myself
Mm,
as child. So child, um, uh, I would like father to do this.
mm.
And so we're always saying the relationship versus saying, I want you to do this.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful.
So yeah, so there's that, and there is actually something about constantly establishing the relationship, which means I have a relationship to you. You are older auntie, or you are younger sibling, and so there's this intimacy in Vietnamese that doesn't exist in English.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, and there's also a directness in Vietnamese too. They don't have as many verb tenses. And so I remember when I would first starting studying Vietnamese, I would directly translate from English to Vietnamese. And there's a lot of padding in English. Do you think I
Oh,
could? Versus,
yeah, yeah.
I want this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot more directness and in Vietnamese that it was, and also first studying it, my vocabulary is so much more limited. So I was also just much more direct. So in
Yeah.
bargaining, I would just, that's, I'm like,
Oh.
too expensive. Like it's just like because my vocabulary was pretty limited. So
Mm-hmm.
I found myself this kind of inner strength and much more direct version of myself coming out in Vietnamese than in English.
Wow. Did you find that that translated to English and communicating with others in English?
I think um yes, and I think what also I again this empathy of recognizing, wow, there are a lot of words my parents don't understand. So when
Mm-hmm.
I came after I finished my PhD, I came back to Seattle to help run our newspaper, and one of the things I would do is check my dad's writing, his emails. And that's when I
Mm-hmm.
realized, wow, there's a lot of grammatical errors, and yet he was so charismatic. And so the language didn't matter because he actually had all these relationships with elected officials and really big community leaders. And so it also made me recognize that language, what we say and what we do really matters and how people feel about us. And
Yes.
then the other thing is I also recognized was in academia, there's a lot of use of jargon.
Mm.
And I actually have really over time simplified my language and really made it plain. And it's in part for accessibility because it's just how would my parents understand this?
Yes.
How would
Yeah.
people with limited English understand these words? And so that's
Mm-hmm.
why I'm not going to ever say microaggression. I'm going to say, oh, you hurt my feelings.
Yeah.
Because that's what at the end of the day it is,
That's what
right?
it is. Yeah.
So, right? Do I need to say it's a microaggression? My feelings were hurt.
Yeah.
I felt bad.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's so many, yeah, you said jargon, terminology, and it feels like the new words keep coming up, it seems like all the time, too.
And we spend so much time then trying to explain the words.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yeah.
versus, hey, there's actually language, that plain language that we can both access.
Mm-hmm.
And even within that, I mean, I do a lot of work around curiosity and respect. And even that is just, what does respect mean to you? What does it mean to me? And that's a word that we both understand. We don't need to come up with an even fancier word for that. We
I
have a lot
know.
of opportunity just with an understanding that word.
Use the simple language that's, and I like what you said, accessible,
Mm-hmm.
that we can, yeah. Which
Mm-hmm.
reminds me of, so I work for, I'm an occupational therapist and I work at
Mm-hmm.
an elementary school. The student body is mostly students of color and
Mm-hmm.
some parents who are immigrants who may have limited English or need a translator, need documents translated and everything. So I always go into communicating with families or in meetings with parents, like even like comparing them to my own parents. How would my
Mm-hmm.
parents understand what I'm saying, what I'm writing? How can I simplify this so it's like they just get straight to the point? And I always think that my parents' English is, I don't know if this is maybe a disservice. I think it's simpler than maybe it really is. I'm not sure. But I always make things more simple just so it's right, more direct, black and white. There's no room for guessing, there's no gray area in our communication.
People have told me now, oh, you explain things in such a clear way and such, because
Mm,
they know my background as an academic. And I take that as a huge compliment. And that's also something that took a
nice.
lot of work. I actually had to unlearn a lot of things.
Wow.
I
Yeah,
had to
there's so
really
many.
practice speaking more simply and plainly because that's actually hard. It's actually really
Yeah,
hard.
that's true. We have so many fillers to like fill in the feelings, I guess. Because
Mhm.
being simple and direct is can seem harsh sometimes, I
Mhm.
guess. So, like
Mhm.
you said, there's all those may you, should I, could you, like,
Mhm.
I mean,
Mhm.
please is okay. Please is fine, but
Mhm.
like, we have a lot of buffers, I feel like.
Mhm. Mhm. And a lot of ways to explain away our feelings versus I'm disappointed,
Yeah,
I'm
which is
hurt.
more powerful. And yeah, because
Yeah.
we don't want to, even though we feel
You.
this way, we don't
Mhm.
want others to feel this way by how
Mhm.
we're feeling. Yeah, it's a weird,
Mhm.
weird conundrum.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for listening. Julie and I will continue this conversation in the next episode. Stay tuned. All original music produced by Stubborn Soul. You can find him on all music listening platforms at STBRNSAL.